May 8, 1942. The Pacific sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor as smoke still rose from the battered hull of USS Yorktown. Commander Joseph John Jocko Clark stood on the dock, his weathered face reflecting the grim reality before him. The massive aircraft carrier, bearing the scars of the Battle of the Coral Sea, appeared to be dying a slow death. Her flight deck was punctured by bomb craters, her hull plates buckled from torpedo damage, and oil slicks spread like dark blood across the harbor waters. Any reasonable assessment would have condemned her to months of repairs, if she could be saved at all. Yet Admiral Chester William Nimitz had other plans. Standing beside Clark, the Pacific Fleet commander's steely gaze fixed upon the wounded giant. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the harbor noise, "we have 72 hours to make her battle-ready again." The audacity of the statement hung in the salt air like a challenge to the laws of physics themselves. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Earl Dickinson, one of Yorktown's dive bomber pilots, watched from the carrier's damaged flight deck as hundreds of workers swarmed aboard. The ship's chief engineer, Commander John Buckmaster, had already begun coordinating what would become one of the most extraordinary repair efforts in naval history. Welding torches sparked to life, creating constellations of light against the darkening sky. The urgency was palpable. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications revealing Operation MI, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll. The Japanese believed they had sunk Yorktown in the Coral Sea engagement, a misconception that would prove catastrophic to their strategic planning. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the ship's commanding officer, moved through the vessel's damaged compartments with grim determination. His crew worked alongside civilian contractors from Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, their faces illuminated by the constant shower of sparks from cutting torches and welding equipment. The men knew they were racing against time, but few understood the true scope of their mission's importance. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the repair effort represented more than mere technical prowess. It embodied American industrial determination. The shipyard workers, many still bearing the psychological scars of December 7th's attack, threw themselves into the task with fierce dedication. Every rivet, every steel plate, every rewelded seam represented defiance against the enemy who had dared to strike at Pearl Harbor. Throughout the first night, the harbor echoed with the symphony of reconstruction. Cranes lifted massive steel plates into position, while teams of workers labored in shifts around the clock. The flight deck, scarred by 500-pound bombs, slowly began to show signs of healing. Temporary patches covered the worst damage, while critical systems were rerouted through undamaged sections of the ship. By dawn of May 9th, the impossible was beginning to seem merely improbable. Yorktown's wounds were being sutured with American steel and determination, though her full recovery remained uncertain. May 9th, 1942. The second day of repairs brought new challenges that tested the limits of human ingenuity and endurance. Chief Petty Officer Walter Lord supervised teams of welders working deep within Yorktown's bowels, where the torpedo damage had twisted the ship's internal structure into a maze of bent metal and ruptured pipes. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of molten steel, while the constant hammering of repairs created a thunderous cacophony that echoed through every compartment. Admiral William Frederick Bull Halsey, originally scheduled to command the task force, lay bedridden with a severe skin condition. His replacement, Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, studied intelligence reports while watching the frantic repair efforts. Spruance understood that Yorktown's participation in the coming battle could mean the difference between victory and devastating defeat. The Japanese fleet approaching Midway included 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, representing the cream of the Imperial Navy's striking power. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leader of Bombing Squadron 6, walked the carrier's damaged flight deck, calculating wind speeds and landing angles. The hastily repaired deck would need to support the weight of fully loaded Dauntless dive bombers, each carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Any structural weakness could prove catastrophic during flight operations, yet there was no time for extensive testing. The repair crews worked with methodical precision despite the crushing time pressure. Shipyard Supervisor James Hamilton coordinated the installation of new boiler tubes while his team rerouted damaged steam lines. The carrier's propulsion system had suffered significant damage, and restoring full power required intricate work on machinery that normally took weeks to access and repair. Commander John Smith Thatch, leader of Fighting Squadron 3, watched his mechanics and armorers prepare the squadron's Grumman Wildcats for combat. The fighters would provide crucial air cover for the task force, but their effectiveness depended entirely on Yorktown's ability to launch and recover aircraft under combat conditions. Every mechanic understood that their work might determine whether American pilots lived or died in the coming battle. As evening approached on the second day, Yorktown's silhouette began to show signs of renewed strength. The gaping holes in her flight deck were covered with steel plating, while her superstructure bristled with repaired gun mounts and radar equipment. Yet beneath the surface improvements, critical systems remained compromised. The ship's structural integrity hung in a delicate balance between urgent necessity and engineering prudence. Captain Elliot Buckmaster reviewed damage control reports in his sea cabin, his face grave with the weight of command. He knew that taking Yorktown to sea in her current condition violated every principle of safe seamanship. Yet the strategic situation demanded risks that peacetime would never justify. The Japanese believed they had eliminated 1/3 of America's Pacific carrier strength, and that misconception had to be preserved until the moment of battle. Throughout Pearl Harbor, word of the extraordinary repair efforts spread among the fleet. Sailors and civilians alike began to speak of the project in hushed, almost reverent tones. The wounded carrier had become a symbol of American determination, proof that the industrial might of the United States could work miracles when necessity demanded it. May 10th, 1942. The final day of repairs dawned with a sense of desperate urgency that permeated every corner of Pearl Harbor. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would command Task Force 17, stood on Ford Island watching the last-minute preparations with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The sight of Yorktown, still surrounded by work barges and repair crews, defied every conventional understanding of naval construction timelines. Commander Joseph James, Jocko Clark, supervised the installation of the final flight deck sections, his experienced eye noting every imperfection that could prove dangerous during combat operations. The deck plates, while structurally sound, lacked the smooth finish of peacetime construction. Pilots would need to compensate for irregular surfaces that could affect aircraft handling during critical takeoff and landing operations. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie, commanding Bombing Squadron 3, briefed his air crews on the unique challenges they would face operating from a hastily repaired carrier. The squadron's Douglas Dauntless dive bombers represented some of America's most potent anti-ship weapons, but their effectiveness depended entirely on Yorktown's ability to position them for attack. Every pilot understood that they were embarking on a mission that would test both their skills and their courage to the absolute limit. The repair effort had consumed enormous quantities of materials and manpower. Steel plates requisitioned from other construction projects now formed part of Yorktown's hull, while electrical cables salvaged from damaged installations restored power to critical systems. Chief Electrician's mate Robert Johnson worked tirelessly to ensure that the carrier's communication systems could function under the stress of combat operations. As afternoon approached, Admiral Nimitz made his final inspection of the repairs. Walking through compartments that still smelled of fresh paint and welding flux, he observed the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for battle. Every sailor, every officer, every civilian worker understood that they were participating in something extraordinary, a feat of engineering and determination that would be remembered long after the war's end. The Japanese, meanwhile, continued their approach toward Midway with complete confidence in their intelligence assessments. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the First Air Fleet, planned his attacks based on the assumption that only two American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, remained operational in the Pacific. The existence of a third carrier would fundamentally alter the balance of forces and potentially doom the entire Japanese operation. Captain Buckmaster received his final sailing orders as the sun began to set over Pearl Harbor. Yorktown would depart before dawn, joining Enterprise and Hornet in what intelligence suggested would be the most important naval battle since Trafalgar. The captain's cabin was filled with charts and operational plans, but his thoughts remained focused on the hundreds of men who would depend on his ship's hastily repaired systems for their survival. The shipyard workers began removing their equipment as darkness fell, their 72-hour marathon finally approaching its end. Chief Constructor Samuel Murray made his final inspection, certifying that Yorktown was seaworthy despite the compromises necessitated by time constraints. His signature on the completion certificate represented more than bureaucratic formality. It was a testament to American industrial capability under the most extreme pressure. Throughout the harbor, other vessels of Task Force 17 made their final preparations. The heavy cruisers Portland and Astoria took on fuel and ammunition, while their crews studied intelligence reports about the approaching Japanese fleet. May 11, 1942. Before dawn broke over the Hawaiian Islands, USS Yorktown's massive screws began turning for the first time since her return from the Coral Sea. The harbor waters churned white as the carrier, still bearing fresh scars beneath her hastily applied paint, moved slowly away from the dock where she had been reborn through sheer determination and American industrial might. Captain Elliot Buckmaster stood on the bridge wing, feeling the familiar vibration of his ship's engines through the steel deck plating. The sensation brought both comfort and concern. While the propulsion system functioned, he could sense the subtle irregularities that spoke of hurried repairs and compromised systems. Chief Engineer John Parsons reported from the engine room that steam pressure remained stable, though several boiler tubes showed stress fractures that would require monitoring throughout the voyage. Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard the heavy cruiser Northampton, watched Yorktown clear the harbor channel with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The admiral understood naval engineering well enough to appreciate the magnitude of what Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers had accomplished. Yet he also knew that taking a damaged vessel into combat represented a calculated risk that could prove catastrophic if the repairs failed at a critical moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise's Air Group 6, studied reconnaissance photographs of the Japanese fleet while considering tactical implications. The presence of Yorktown would provide American forces with a crucial third deck for launching strikes against the enemy carriers. However, the hastily repaired ship's limitations meant that her air group would need to be employed carefully, avoiding situations that might stress her damaged systems beyond their limits. As Yorktown cleared Pearl Harbor, her crew settled into the rhythm of wartime sailing. Aviation ordnance men armed the Dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes crowded onto her flight deck, while mechanics performed final checks on the Wildcat fighters that would provide air cover. Every man aboard understood that they were sailing toward what might prove to be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. The ship's damage control parties conducted continuous inspections of the repaired sections, monitoring for signs of structural failure or system degradation. Lieutenant George Gay, a torpedo bomber pilot with Squadron 8, noted the subtle differences in the ship's motion as she encountered ocean swells. The repairs had altered Yorktown's weight distribution, affecting her stability in ways that would require careful attention during flight operations. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet continued its approach toward Midway, unaware that their intelligence picture had been fundamentally compromised. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the massive battleship Yamato, reviewed final plans for Operation MI with complete confidence in Japanese naval superiority. The combined fleet represented the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled, with over 200 vessels, including the 4 fleet carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. As referenced in Gordon Prange's comprehensive study, Miracle at Midway, the Japanese operational plan assumed that American carrier strength had been reduced to 2 vessels following the Coral Sea engagement. This miscalculation would prove to have profound strategic consequences, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the coming battle. Yorktown's departure from Pearl Harbor marked more than a tactical movement. It represented a triumph of American industrial capability and determination. The carrier's presence at Midway would provide Admiral Fletcher with options and flexibility that the Japanese had not anticipated in their careful calculations of relative force strength. Throughout the night, Task Force 17 maintained radio silence while proceeding toward the designated rendezvous point northeast of Midway Atoll. May 13, 1942. Task Force 17 joined with Task Force 16 in the waters northeast of Midway Atoll, creating the largest concentration of American naval power since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, embarked aboard Yorktown, assumed tactical command of the combined force, while Admiral Raymond Spruance retained control of Enterprise and Hornet. The sight of 3 American carriers operating together sent a powerful psychological message to every sailor present. The United States Navy had not merely survived December 7th, but had grown stronger in the crucible of war. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst whose intelligence work had made the entire operation possible, continued monitoring Japanese communications from his basement headquarters at Pearl Harbor. His team's intercepts confirmed that Admiral Nagumo's striking force remained unaware of the American trap being prepared. The Japanese believed they would face at most 2 American carriers, and their tactical planning reflected this fundamental miscalculation. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying reconnaissance missions from Yorktown's hastily repaired deck, observed the intricate dance of naval formations as the American fleet positioned itself for battle. The carrier's flight operations proceeded smoothly despite her recent repairs, though pilots noted subtle differences in deck motion that required slight adjustments to their landing techniques. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate John Snowden supervised the arming of dive bombers with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, each weapon capable of penetrating the deck armor of Japanese carriers. The Japanese fleet, meanwhile, continued its approach toward Midway with the confidence born of 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 1st Air Fleet from the bridge of Akagi, reviewed final attack plans with his staff officers. The carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the East Indies, and ravaged the Indian Ocean approached what its commanders believed would be another routine operation against inferior opposition. Captain Buckmaster conducted detailed inspections of Yorktown's repaired sections, accompanied by Chief Constructor Samuel Murray, who had remained aboard to monitor the structural integrity of his emergency repairs. The flight deck showed no signs of failure despite the constant stress of aircraft operations, while the hull plates held firm against the Pacific swells. Yet both men knew that the true test would come under combat conditions, when damage control parties might be forced to work around the compromised areas while fighting fires and flooding. Air operations from all 3 American carriers proceeded with increasing intensity as the fleets converged on Midway. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, briefed his air crews on the devastating anti-aircraft fire they could expect from Japanese carriers. The squadron's obsolescent Devastator torpedo bombers would need to approach their targets at low altitude, making them extremely vulnerable to enemy fighters and defensive gunfire. As evening approached on May 13th, American radio intercept stations detected increased Japanese naval communications, indicating that the enemy fleet was approaching its final attack positions. The intelligence confirmed what Rochefort's team had predicted. The Japanese would launch their initial strikes against Midway Atoll before dawn, attempting to neutralize the island's air defenses in preparation for an amphibious assault. Admiral Fletcher made his final tactical dispositions as darkness fell over the Pacific. The American carriers would remain northeast of Midway, positioned to launch coordinated strikes against the Japanese fleet once enemy intentions became clear. Yorktown's air group, despite operating from a damaged ship, would play a crucial role in the coming battle through the superior training and determination of her air crews. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future course of the Pacific War. 3 American carriers faced 4 Japanese carriers in waters where the margin for error had been eliminated by months of careful planning and the extraordinary repair effort that had restored Yorktown to combat capability. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke over Midway Atoll as the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on radar screens, their formations dark against the morning sky. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had launched 108 aircraft toward the American-held island, beginning the battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific. Aboard USS Yorktown, Captain Buckmaster received the initial contact reports with grim satisfaction. The enemy had revealed his position exactly as American intelligence had predicted. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Henderson, commanding Yorktown's Combat Information Center, plotted the incoming Japanese formations while coordinating with Enterprise and Hornet. The hastily repaired radar equipment functioned perfectly, providing clear pictures of enemy aircraft movements despite the improvised installation of replacement components. Chief Radarman Robert Martinez monitored the screens with intense concentration, knowing that early warning would prove crucial to American survival in the coming battle. The Japanese pilots approaching Midway represented some of the finest naval aviators in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the devastating carrier raids across the Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the attack formation with supreme confidence, unaware that American codebreakers had provided their enemy with complete knowledge of Japanese intentions and timing. The element of surprise, so crucial to Japanese tactical doctrine, had been turned completely against them. Admiral Fletcher made the momentous decision to launch his first strike, while the Japanese attack planes remained committed to their assault on Midway. The American carriers began launching aircraft at precisely 0706 hours, with Yorktown's air group taking off from her battle-scarred but functional flight deck. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 aloft, his pilots grimly aware that they were flying toward the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. Commander John Thatch launched his Fighting Squadron 3 from Yorktown, the Wildcat fighters climbing rapidly to gain altitude advantage over the expected Japanese combat air patrol. Thatch had developed innovative tactical formations designed to counter the superior maneuverability of Japanese Zero fighters, tactics that would soon be tested in the crucible of aerial combat. As the American strike groups departed their carriers, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft finally detected the presence of 3 American flat tops northeast of Midway. The report reached Admiral Nagumo at 0728 hours, causing immediate consternation on the bridge of Akagi. Intelligence had assured the Japanese commander that only 2 American carriers remained operational in the Pacific, following the Coral Sea engagement. The sighting of Yorktown sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, immediately recognized the strategic implications of facing 3 enemy carriers instead of the expected 2. The carefully calculated force ratios that had governed Japanese planning were suddenly invalidated by the presence of a ship that intelligence insisted had been sunk or severely damaged beyond repair. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort's intelligence coup had achieved its intended effect: complete Japanese surprise at American strength and positioning. The enemy fleet committed to attacking Midway now faced the nightmare scenario of defending against coordinated carrier strikes, while their own aircraft were dispersed and low on fuel. Admiral Nagumo faced an agonizing tactical dilemma. His first attack wave against Midway was still in progress, requiring recovery and refueling before it could be employed against the American carriers. Meanwhile, his second-wave aircraft were armed with land attack bombs rather than the armor-piercing weapons needed for anti-ship operations. Changing armament would consume precious time while American strikes approached his fleet. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya's authoritative account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the appearance of Yorktown fundamentally altered Japanese tactical calculations and contributed to the fatal delays that would characterize their response to the American attack. The battle was now fully joined, with both fleets committed to a decisive engagement that would determine control of the Central Pacific for years to come. June 4, 1942. At precisely 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet spread across the Pacific like a deadly constellation. The sight of 4 enemy carriers protected by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers represented the most formidable naval target American aviators had ever approached. McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, immediately recognized that he was witnessing the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy assembled for what they believed would be their final victorious battle. Aboard Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher monitored radio communications as American strike groups converged on the enemy fleet from multiple directions. The carrier's hastily repaired communication systems functioned flawlessly, providing clear coordination between the scattered attack formations despite the improvised installation of replacement equipment. Chief Radio Man William Patterson managed the complex flow of tactical information while maintaining contact with Pearl Harbor and the approaching strike aircraft. The Japanese carriers presented a magnificent yet terrifying sight to the American air crews. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu maneuvered in defensive formations, while their escorting vessels threw up intense walls of anti-aircraft fire. The carrier's flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for strikes against the newly discovered American fleet, creating conditions that would prove catastrophic when American bombs began to fall. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 in their obsolescent devastators toward the Japanese fleet, fully aware that his aircraft faced almost certain destruction. The squadron's slow, low-flying attack profile made them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns, yet their sacrifice would draw enemy combat air patrol away from the high-flying dive bombers that represented America's best hope for victory. Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3, approached the Japanese fleet from high altitude while observing the systematic destruction of American torpedo squadrons below. The sight of his fellow aviators being shot down in flames filled him with cold determination to make their sacrifice meaningful through accurate bomb delivery against the enemy carriers. At 0:10:24 hours, the first American bombs began falling on the Japanese fleet. Enterprise's dive bombers achieved devastating hits on Akagi and Kaga, their 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapons penetrating flight decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft. The resulting explosions and fires turned the pride of the Japanese fleet into floating funeral pyres within minutes of the first successful attacks. Yorktown's air group achieved equally spectacular results against the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Leslie's dive bombers scored direct hits that ignited massive fires among the aircraft spotted on her flight deck. The carrier, which had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and countless other Japanese victories, was transformed into a blazing wreck by the bombs delivered from the hastily repaired American carrier. The Japanese fleet, which had dominated Pacific waters for 6 months, was suddenly reeling from coordinated attacks that destroyed 3 of their 4 fleet carriers within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, watching his flagship Akagi burn with helpless rage, could only marvel at the precision and timing of the American assault. The intelligence failure that had concealed Yorktown's presence had contributed directly to the tactical disaster now unfolding across his fleet. Captain Buckmaster observed the progress of the battle from Yorktown's bridge, his confidence in his ship's hasty repairs validated by the flawless performance of her aircraft launching and recovery systems. The flight deck that had been shattered by Japanese bombs just weeks earlier now served as the platform for one of the most decisive airstrikes in naval history. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, immediately launched retaliatory strikes against the American fleet. Her aircraft, guided by reconnaissance reports, headed directly toward the three American carriers that had administered such devastating punishment to the Japanese force. The battle was far from over, and Yorktown's survival would soon depend on the structural integrity of her emergency repairs. June 4, 1942. At 14:30 hours, 18 Japanese dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu screamed down through scattered clouds toward USS Yorktown, their pilots determined to avenge the destruction of their fleet mates. The attack represented the dying gasp of Japanese carrier aviation, yet it carried enough venom to test every repair made during those miraculous 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. Captain Buckmaster watched the enemy aircraft approach with the calm determination of a professional naval officer who had accepted that his ship would face the ultimate test of battle damage. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck near the island superstructure, the explosion tearing through the hastily installed steel plating and revealing the fundamental vulnerability of emergency repairs. Chief Damage Control Officer Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich immediately organized firefighting parties while assessing the extent of structural damage to the areas that had been rebuilt in such desperate haste. Despite the hits she absorbed, Yorktown's emergency repairs proved their worth under combat conditions. The flight deck, while damaged again, maintained sufficient structural integrity to support continued aircraft operations. The improvised electrical systems continued functioning, providing power to damage control equipment and maintaining communication with the other vessels in the task force. Chief Constructor Samuel Murray's emergency design modifications had created a ship that could absorb punishment and continue fighting. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship damaged but still operational, transferred his command to the heavy cruiser Astoria, while Yorktown's crew battled fires and flooding. The sight of the wounded carrier continuing to operate aircraft vindicated every hour of the desperate repair effort at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Dickinson successfully landed his damaged Dauntless on Yorktown's scarred deck, proving that the hastily repaired flight deck could still recover aircraft under combat conditions. At approximately 15:30 hours, Japanese torpedo bombers from Hiryu approached for a second attack on the already damaged American carrier. Captain Buckmaster ordered maximum speed from his engineering plant, and the hastily repaired propulsion system responded magnificently, driving Yorktown through evasive maneuvers at 24 knots despite her accumulated battle damage. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding compartments and causing the carrier to develop a dangerous list. The damage control organization that had been disrupted by the hasty repairs struggled to contain the flooding, yet the basic structural integrity of the ship held firm. Chief Petty Officer Walter Lord supervised pumping operations while damage control parties shored up bulkheads that had been weakened by the emergency construction work. As Yorktown lay dead in the water, her list increasing steadily, the Japanese submarine I-168 approached for what appeared would be the coup de grace. The submarine's torpedoes struck both Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, which had been alongside providing assistance. The additional damage finally overwhelmed the carrier's compromised watertight integrity, and Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandon ship. Yet even in apparent defeat, Yorktown had achieved a strategic victory that validated every minute of her miraculous repair. Her presence at Midway had contributed directly to the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers, eliminating the cream of enemy naval aviation and permanently altering the balance of power in the Pacific. The ship that Japanese intelligence believed had been eliminated at Coral Sea had struck the decisive blow at Midway. The 72-hour miracle at Pearl Harbor had created more than a repaired ship. It had forged a symbol of American determination and industrial capability. Yorktown's participation in the Battle of Midway demonstrated that American shipyard workers could perform impossibilities when the survival of their nation demanded it. As referenced in naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive account, the repair and deployment of USS Yorktown represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of naval construction. The carrier that rose from near destruction to strike at the heart of Japanese naval power had proven that American determination could work miracles when combined with industrial skill and unwavering courage. June 6, 1942, USS Yorktown finally succumbed to her accumulated damage and slipped beneath the Pacific waves. But her legacy lived on in the shattered remnants of Japanese carrier aviation scattered across the Midway battlefield. The ship had fulfilled her destiny, proving that sometimes the most important victories emerge from the ashes of apparent defeat.